Quiet on set. Speed and action.
I don't want to be a product of my environment. I want my environment to be a product of me.
Welcome to the Foot and Friends on Film podcast, discussing everything about cinema. Now here's your host, Nick Mailer.
As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
Let's have an adventure.
You talking to me? I'm not fucking. Go home and get your fucking shine box.
Welcome to the official podcast of Foot and Friends on Film.com. I'm your host, Nick Mailer. It's episode number 2. We've launched our official YouTube channel, so be sure to like and subscribe. Today's episode is all about the works of Mr. Martin Scorsese. We're going to be talking about everything from his early years all the way up to The Irishman and what's coming next. So take your seats. It's time for your feature presentation. Once again, we are the official podcast of Foot and Friends on Film.com, where our motto is any film you have not seen is a new experience. I got on the phone with John this week and we talked Scorsese. We're both big fans. The man has a career that spans over 5 decades, and there was a hell of a lot to talk about. So without further ado, please welcome John H. Foote. So how's it going?
Cold day, but is what it is. It's winter.
It is. It's winter in Canada. Let's get right to it. There are some who would say film directing is a young man's game. What has the last decade taught us about that?
Absolute baloney, and probably the most arrogant statement Quentin Tarantino has ever made. If you look at the body of work of Steven Spielberg, Woody Allen, Clint Eastwood, and our subject today, Martin Scorsese, I think the 4 of them alone blow that comment to hell. And Scorsese alone, in the second half of his career, since Gangs of New York, has done some of the finest work of his career. So, Tarantino he's a fine director, he's a great writer, but he really needs to get over himself and recognize that there are other filmmakers out there who are superior to him.
I just want to make a note to our listeners. If you hear a little jingling, I do apologize. I have one of our fans is my dog Teddy, and he's kind of just roaming around here. So I would agree, and I obviously think that the last decade has been dominated. Scorsese is, you're right, his body of work is ridiculously impressive. I want to go back to the beginning. Can you take a moment just to talk about Who's That Knocking at My Door, pre-70s Scorsese?
Yeah, Who's That Knocking at My Door was one of the films that he made while he was at NYU studying. He later became a professor there. The school there was so impressed with his work and his knowledge of film history, they made him a professor. But Who's That Knocking on My Door was like his thesis film, and was eventually distributed by Warner Brothers and quite well reviewed, well enough to get him a deal in Hollywood, well enough to get him out of New York to go to Hollywood to start making pictures out there. Before he left, he worked on Woodstock as a film editor with his friend Thelma Shoemaker, who became his go-to film editor in 1980. And I think that experience cutting Woodstock made Scorsese the director he is today, because he learned how to put a shot together. And I think he was already quite well on his way to being brilliant in the concept of a shot and the execution of a shot. But in the editing room, he learned how they go together and how to break them up and how to break the narrative. And working with Shoemaker, I think, was the best thing that ever happened to him.
There are some who would say she is an artistic talent on the same level as him. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The best film editor in the history of the movies, I think.
Comedian Patton Oswalt has a very insightful and funny stand-up bit where he talks about how all the best films are directed by a man and edited by a woman. because it's like the guy is out there just shooting off a bunch of film with his big camera dick, and then cans and cans and cans of film go to the editor. The woman's okay, I have to make a story out of this now. We're not going to have an 18-hour movie. When I heard that, I immediately thought of Scorsese and Shoemaker. Now,
It's a good argument because Steven Spielberg, when he made Jaws, everything went wrong on that set. The shark sank. The second shark sank. The shark wasn't working, and he's sending these cans of film back to Verna Fields in Hollywood, and she's got to cut the film together. So they finally had a conversation where Spielberg says, "You know what? Don't show the shark. Let's cut away from the shark." And so they used barrels, they used the fin, they used the tail, they used reactions. And Verna Fields got a lot of credit for Jaws being the film it was. So much so that Spielberg didn't want to work with her again. When he was young, he was extremely immature and arrogant, and he wanted all the credit for Jaws. So they never worked together again, which was quite a crime because she was a real talent. Scorsese never had that problem. He was happy to share credit with everybody.
let's talk a bit about the Hollywood New Wave of the 1970s. We've obviously mentioned Scorsese and Spielberg. Talk about that group of filmmakers and where Scorsese fits into that picture in the early 70s.
Absolutely. There's a great story that circulates Hollywood that in 1969 through 1971, on a beach in Malibu, there was a cottage rented by Margot Kidder, who was a Canadian actress who'd moved to Hollywood and was looking for a career. And every Sunday, she would entertain a group of young up-and-coming filmmakers. Always the same guys showed up: Brian De Palma, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, and John Milius. So imagine sitting in that room with those six minds, and they're talking about what their future films are going to be. Coppola had just won an Oscar for Patton. He was negotiating The Godfather. Lucas was getting set to do American Graffiti. So they've all got different projects in various stages of work. Scorsese was by far the most different of the group. He'd arrived dressed in three-piece white suits, old world charm. He'd bring flowers for the ladies and gifts for the wives if Eleanor Coppola happened to be there. And he's a tiny man. He's 5'4". And yet when he talks film, his eyes blaze. I mean, I've interviewed him. His eyes just go bright, 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 astounding laser eyes. And his whole body tenses up and the hands are going. So imagine being in that room and listening to Scorsese talk about what his up and coming projects were. It must have been extraordinary. And when they started making their films, Coppola had the greatest success at the beginning, obviously, but he wasn't shy about sharing his success with the other filmmakers. George Lucas benefited huge from Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola produced American Graffiti. But when they were looking for a director for The Godfather Part 2, Francis Ford Coppola suggested Martin Scorsese, and the studios wanted Coppola to do it, and of course he did. But Scorsese was always on the radar of every major studio in the business. And of course, when he broke through with Mean Streets, the gates opened.
Of course. And Mean Streets significantly marks the collaboration between Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro.
Yes.
Which has lasted decades. And this past year with The Irishman, we got to see a reunion after almost 25 years of them not having worked together. Can you talk a little bit about how they've influenced each other? And is there any other actor-director relationship that compares as far as being iconic to that of De Niro and Scorsese?
I think there are, but I think they're all very different. I think there's another relationship in Scorsese's life with Leonardo DiCaprio. I think in a lot of ways, De Niro was Scorsese's muse. DiCaprio is his more modern muse. Other filmmakers to have this with stars. John Ford had it with John Wayne. They just brought out the best in each other, which was always exciting, very exciting to see. Mike Nichols had it with a number of actors and actresses, Meryl Streep and Jack Nicholson to name two. But I think Scorsese and De Niro have a very unique relationship in that they almost complete one another, which might sound foolish and homoerotic, and I don't mean it to, but they just tap into what the other does best. and bring out the best in each other. People forget that it was De Niro that took Raging Bull to Scorsese. Scorsese didn't want to make a boxing film. And De Niro took that film to him, talked him into doing it, and the result is one of the greatest films in the history of the movies. So and I also believe De Niro brought him The Irishman years
Yes.
ago, took him that book. And so they take each other work that they're interested in doing. I think De Niro knows what Scorsese can do best, which is anything he wants, quite honestly. And for the number of films they've made together, they've also had a number of films fall through. De Niro was scheduled to play Jesus Christ in The Last Temptation of Christ in the 1980s, and it fell through the day before shooting was going to start. In terms of their work together, when De Niro exploded into the 70s, and he did explode, it was with Mean Streets, Bang the Drum Slowly, and a film called The Godfather Part 2, for which he won the Academy Award. Overnight, he was one of the most electrifying actors in movies, and he just radiated a sense of menace and unpredictability and danger. And Scorsese seemed to know how to tap into that and bring that out. They both came from the same neighborhood. You know, they were both born in the mean streets of New York City. They grew up in those streets, and they get those streets. So when they go back to that in their storytelling, I think they bring out the both of each other, because they know so well what to do, what to put up on screen.
Yes, and speaking of their upbringing, and of course both New York natives, Scorsese, his family lived in Little Italy. As a child, Martin Scorsese had asthma. As you mentioned, he's not a man of big stature.
Yes.
Do you see somehow perhaps his relationship with Robert De Niro, he saw in De Niro maybe an analog of what he could have been had he not been hindered by these difficulties? And where do you think that the themes of Italian American identity and New York as a character and Catholicism, which have permeated throughout his career, talk a little bit about that, and why do you think it's something that he keeps revisiting?
First of all, I think what he sees in De Niro is a big brother more than anything else, a big brother. I don't think he ever wanted to be an actor. He's acted on occasion, but I don't think he ever wanted to do what it is De Niro does. I think they connected as artists and became best friends in the process, and are still very dear friends. Everything that you mentioned, thematically, he's explored in all of his movies, time and time again. And people have to remember, Martin Scorsese very nearly became a priest. He was so entrenched in Catholicism, he very nearly walked that road and pulled out when he discovered movies. And you're absolutely right. He did have asthma, terrible asthma. Spent a lot of time watching television in the 1950s and 60s, and spent a lot of time at a movie house just down the street from him. And the types of films he watched when he was a young boy are radically different from the films he made. He enjoyed movies like The Robe and The King of Kings, and big budget musicals like Oklahoma and American in Paris, Singing in the Rain, Gigi by Vincent Minnelli. He loved color and scope on film. The Ten Commandments was one of his favorite films. The Searchers is one of his favorite films. And it's interesting that he became the director he became, loving the films that he loved. But you can see homages to those films in many of his movies. Taxi Driver is an extraordinary homage to The Searchers in so many ways, but so dark. The Last Temptation of Christ is an extraordinary biblical film, not populated with a cast of thousands, but more realistically, and shot in the Holy Land as well, which was remarkable. So all of his childhood, all of his upbringing is in every film he's ever made, in different ways, always in different ways.
Let's talk about Taxi Driver. Where do you think this falls amongst his filmography as far as one of the best?
Well, absolutely. Top five, easily. I remember the first day I saw Taxi Driver. I saw it opening day in an afternoon matinee. There was about 10 people in the theater. And I walked in knowing I was going to see Robert De Niro, but not knowing much about Martin Scorsese. And when I came out, I knew two things. Martin Scorsese was going to be a major filmmaker, and Robert De Niro had just given one of the greatest performances in the history of the movies. And that remains. It's an alarming movie. It's like a time bomb ticking down throughout. And when De Niro goes off, when he finally, the violence is unleashed, even today, 40, over 40 years later, it's such an explosion of violence. You can't quite believe what you're seeing. And that was the first real bathed in gore movie I'd really seen that wasn't a horror film. And the shootings were realistic. I mean, when he shoots that dude's fingers off, you swear to God, you're seeing the real thing. And that moment when he's covered in blood, he's shaved his head, he's covered in blood, everyone else's blood and his own, and he puts the finger to his head and asks the cop to shoot him. That's what Travis wants all along anyway, is to die. He can't live in the world that he lives in. New York is obscene to him in every way. And it was such an intense and searing movie. Even to this day, when I think about it, I get shivers, and it galvanized me. I went back and saw it the next day and saw it a week later. It was that powerful, that strong.
Well, how do you interpret the ending?
I interpret the ending literal. He survived. Iris got home to her parents in Minnesota, and Betsy gets in the car, and she genuinely wants him to ask her out again. He's a celebrity now. He's a hero. He's not the weirdo she thought he was. But watch his eyes, because the eyes in the rearview mirror at the end of the film are exactly like they were at the beginning of the film. He's going to go do this again and again and again until he's stopped or killed, one or the other. He's madness personified.
All right, we're going to talk a little bit about this again later as we discuss some of Scorsese's later work, and obviously the influence it had on Joker, which happened
Sure.
this past year. But I'd like to ask you a little bit about New York, and where you feel that movie falls amongst the filmography of Scorsese, and talk about the performances.
Well, the performances are flawed. On one hand, you have Liza Minnelli, who had won the Oscar for Cabaret, had won a Tony Award on Broadway for The Act, which Scorsese directed. And she's in her element. This is a big budget, big band movie, and she is terrific. The problem is De Niro. De Niro, from the opening frame, is annoying. He plays a complete jerk, and he's so good you can't stand to watch him in the film. He's just a total dick. And it made it very hard to care about either of the characters. His character was so dislikable, and the movie fell away from me. The first time I saw it, it fell away from me in a big way. When it was recut and restored, and they put back the 35 minutes of the studio cut, it's a better film, no question. It's a better film. Producers should never mess with a movie because they're not directors. And restoring the ending with the scene Happy Endings, Liza Minnelli, that great big band production number, is superb. And so what Scorsese did with New York, he made a surrealistic, modern musical that paid homage to the big band movies of the 40s and the 50s, the movies he loved, the Vincent Minnelli movies. But Robert De Niro was woefully miscast as Jimmy, just woefully miscast. And yeah, fine, he learned to play the saxophone and all the fingering is right. But his character is just a monster. You can't stand him. You can't imagine why Francine is with this guy. And in my mind, that's why it failed.
Speaking of De Niro and casting and even being a monster, Raging Bull is often considered one of the greatest sports movies of all time. Do you consider it a true sports movie?
Yes. It's also one of the greatest movies of all time. But that said, it's one of the most punishing film experiences you could ever have. It's not a movie I return to watch over and over and over again. The first time I saw it with my friend Kevin McDonald from the Kids in the Hall. In 1980, we were theater students, and we zipped downtown to see it, and blown away by it. Blown away by De Niro, Joe Pesci, Kathy Moriarty, Scorsese's direction, the boxing sequences, everything. I mean, we had just come out of the Rocky generation, so Rocky and Rocky II had been released, and we'd seen what we thought were realistic boxing scenes. Nothing compared to this. Scorsese put you in the ring, and you felt every punch and heard every punch and heard what the boxer heard, kind of that flawed sound when you get too many shots to the head. And De Niro's performance was otherworldly. I mean, just otherworldly. He went to another level beyond method acting to give this performance. And the studio foolishly argued with Scorsese. They kept saying, after De Niro had gained 80 pounds, and for Jake LaMotta is this out of shape fat man, they said, no, leave it till the end. Let it be a big reveal. And Scorsese said, no, we've got to show it right away or they're never going to get into the story. So the film opens with in the ring, and he's shadowboxing over the opening titles. And that tells us what the film is about, because he's always at war with himself. And we cut to Jake LaMotta in the ring. He wins the fight, and then we cut to Jake LaMotta, grossly overweight as a dreadful stand-up comedian years later. And Scorsese was exactly right. We're stunned. You suck your breath in when you see him for the first time, and then you're into the story. And what a story. What a profoundly disturbing story.
So powerful, that quick cut between the two versions of LaMotta as a young, fit man, and then to see
Yes.
it later. Yeah, so powerful. It's hard to imagine the studio couldn't get on board with that idea.
There's a great story that when he showed it for the first time, United Artists was in big trouble with another film that year called Heaven's Gate. And Michael Cimino had spent $44 million on this awful Western. Scorsese had $7 million to make Raging Bull. And to do that, he had to shoot New York to look like it looked in the 40s and the 50s. And when it screened for the first time, Arthur Krim, the president of United Artists Films, stood up, walked to the back of the room, stood in front of Martin Scorsese, shook his hand and said, Mr. Scorsese, you are an artist. Congratulations, and walked out of the room. So they were absolutely on side with the film he made. 8 Academy Award nominations, the most that year, and it won twice, Best Actor and Best Editing.
The king of comedy. Bit of a far cry from Jake LaMotta is Rupert Pupkin. In my estimation, it's one of my favorite Robert De Niro performances. I would argue one of his best. What do you think?
I would agree. And again, completely unexpected. But he's unhinged. I mean, he is a whack job in every way. And I thought Scorsese showed enormous courage casting Jerry Lewis as the Johnny Carson talk host guy, Jerry Langford. Jerry Lewis is a very prickly personality and not an easy man to get along with, not an easy man to like. And yet I thought his performance in that film was actually stronger than De Niro's. He should have won the Oscar that year for Best Supporting Actor. De Niro was brilliant as Rupert Pupkin. But again, he's insane. He's absolutely insane. We see what he is, living in his mother's basement with all these cutouts and pretending to be talking to Langford, having all these fantasies. And then he kidnaps him. He and his friend Masha kidnap the man. And yet he ends up on television. He goes where he wants to go. He's famous. And that scene at the end, is it fantasy? Is it real? Who knows? Who knows? These days, criminals are as famous as normal people,
Yeah, I watched it with a friend of mine, and I think he gave an insightful description. He said Rupert Pupkin is like a human paper cut.
That's perfect. What a perfect description. He is. Yeah. And poor Shelley Long, every time she sees him coming in that movie, the first time she doesn't know what to expect, but every time after that, she knows exactly what he is. Yeah. And the look in her face when he says, I'm the king, she knows exactly everything she's thought about him has been exactly spot on. He's a nut.
How do you think Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy, there's obviously very similar, some similar ideas and similar sort of, I mean, while Travis Bickle and Rupert Pupkin are obviously very, very different characters, they go through similar journeys.
Yes.
Now, I want to talk about The Last Temptation of Christ. And okay. Obviously, big, getting back to the themes that have resurfaced in Scorsese's career, this was a ballsy movie to make.
Absolutely. He wanted to do this since the 70s. Barbara Hershey, an actress, gave him the book in the 70s. He read it, and he started putting together the production of the movie. And in 82, it was almost set to go with Robert De Niro. And as I said, funding fell away at the last minute. It was set to go 2 years later with Aidan Quinn as Jesus. And again, funding fell away. But he made The Color of Money in 1986 and Paul Newman won the Academy Award. It was very successful at the box office, well reviewed. So Garth Dobrinsky, the Cineplex guy, gave him the money to make the movie, gave him $8 million and said, go away, make the film the way you want. So he did. Now, $8 million is not a lot of money to make a movie, and it's certainly not a lot of money to make a biblical film. So Scorsese shot it very smartly, very low budget. And if you watch real close, a lot of the actors that played the disciples are also playing Roman soldiers in different shots. He just had to populate the movie with background people. When the film came out, it was initially going to play the Toronto Film Festival, but screenings of it had been given to some of the religious leaders in the world, and they lost their collective minds. They truly did. So they put it out in August of 1988. And I saw it in 88. Second day it was open in Toronto at the Carlton Cinema, and we were standing in line to go in, and they were picketing outside. And I asked the guy, I said, what exactly are you protesting? And he said, oh, I haven't seen it, but we've been told it's wrong. Our church tells us it's wrong. And I said, and that kind of blind faith is okay with you? And he said, well, if the church says so. And I thought, oh my God. Saw the film, and I struggle with religion, as I know you do. And yet it was one of the most inspiring religious films I've ever seen. Scorsese portrays Jesus as a man who hears voices telling him who he is and what he might be and what he needs to do. So we watch this guy go through the motions of healing, which he does, but always questioning why he's doing it. And the scene with Pilate when he's condemned to die, David Bowie plays Pilate, and he's wonderful because it's so matter of fact. It takes place in his stable, and he just looks at Christ and says, you know what's going to happen now? And he said, you people should really go take a walk at Golgotha sometime and see the skulls up there. And Christ realizes he's going to be crucified. And the terror that Willem Dafoe portrays this character with of crucifixion is absolutely remarkable. And I think it's a stunning film. I thought it was the best film of its year. I named it the best picture of the year in 88 and got a ton of flack about it, but I don't care. I stand by that. Scorsese got the film's single Academy Award nomination, and I give the Academy a lot of credit for nominating him because it was saying to you, you know, good job, good, bold film.
I couple of thoughts on that. I remember first time I saw it, and what struck me so much was that obviously Jesus, carpenter, what's he making with his wood?
Crosses.
I instantly was just like, this is so fascinating, just right away.
Yeah.
I also, hindsight is 2020, and Willem Dafoe's performance is brilliant, but I have to wonder, it's like, what was Martin Scorsese thinking, casting a guy who looks like the Joker, like without makeup, as his Jesus? And it worked, but Willem Dafoe is, he's got a menacing look about him. So, I mean, it's an inspired piece of casting.
You know why he cast him?
Explain.
I can tell you. Willem Dafoe explained it to me because I asked him, and he said Scorsese told him that he saw his performance in Platoon. And there's a scene where he talks to Charlie Sheen in Platoon about the U.S. and Vietnam, and they're going to lose this war. And he does it with such gentle humility. Martin Scorsese said there was an absolute ethereal beauty to Willem Dafoe that he'd never seen before. And then he's got that great death scene where he dies crucified, reaching for the skies, full of bullets. And Scorsese said, that's my guy. So that's why he cast him. And the result was, you're absolutely right. It's a stunning performance. I think the best of Dafoe's career.
Well, there you have it, folks. Your story about the picketer, I can't help but be reminded of a very famous story about one of my favorite filmmakers, who's also a massive fan of The Last Temptation of Christ. Kevin Smith made a movie called Dogma.
Yes.
Which had a lot to do with Catholicism. And
brilliant movie.
Yes, one of my favorites. I always say is one of the most insightful film commentaries on faith and religiosity. Has a rubber poop monster in it. But he experienced pickets outside of screenings of Dogma, and he famously joined in.
Yeah,
pretended to be a protester.
That's
and
Kevin.
And he repeated, and he was interviewed on the news, And someone asked him what he was protesting. And he said, I haven't seen the movie, but from what I heard, it's not good.
Yeah, yeah.
So
That's exactly what we experienced. Sherry and I were stunned. We're absolutely stunned because the guy looked me in the eye and said, well, I haven't seen it. And what are you picketing then? I mean, he was there because his church had asked him to be, and he went. And he had no interest in seeing it. Same thing happened with The Passion of the Christ years later with Mel Gibson's film.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a conversation for another podcast.
Yes,
But
yes.
so we're getting into what people would most likely often describe as Martin Scorsese's magnum opus. He released a little movie in 1990. Let's talk about it.
Goodfellas, based on the book Wise Guy. And it's based on a true story of Henry Hill, who became a rat, turned state's evidence, and was placed in the witness protection program, and just couldn't stay there, just couldn't stay out of the life. You know, he loved being a gangster so much. He got out of the witness protection program, and the FBI gave up. They said, we can't deal with you anymore. We can't protect you. But the film deals with his early rise in the mob in New York, and it's very different from The Godfather because this is neighborhood mafia. This is mafia of the boroughs, soprano type mafia. And Scorsese, I mean, everything in this film. This is a perfect motion picture, and one of the few movies that you can't find a flaw in. And if you can, you're probably looking wrong or looking at it wrong or thinking about it wrong. It's beautifully acted by Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, Paul Sorvino, Lorraine Bracco, Ray Liotta. I mean, there's not a weak performance in the entire film. Frank Vincent has a very brief scene, and he's terrific. Catherine Scorsese, Marty's mother, is wonderful, as Joe Pesci's mother. The direction is spot on. Spot on. The framing, the concept, the ideas, the theory, perfect. The editing, I don't think you'll find a better edited film. And the writing is a landmark. The cinematography, that shot through the Copacabana, through the bowels of the Copacabana, has been replicated and copied and pay homage to so many times, but never done as well. Even this year in The Irishman, I think Scorsese's paying homage to it at the beginning when we pan through the old age home at the beginning of the film and come upon De Niro in the wheelchair. I think that's an homage to Goodfellas.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. And interesting, it won every single critics group award, the New York, the LA, the National Society of Film Critics, Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor. The Academy goes with Dances with Wolves, a good film, a legitimately good film, nicely directed by Kevin Costner, but in no way a better film than Goodfellas. No way.
What struck me about Goodfellas years later is I picked up a copy of the book Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi.
Yeah.
And read it, and I couldn't believe how much of that was a true story.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was really ignorant to that. The most fascinating thing I know about that book and movie and story is that Joe Pesci plays Tommy DeVito.
Yes.
Tommy DeVito is the character is named after Pesci's friend from the Four Seasons, Frankie Valli's singing group, who Pesci was very involved in the early days. But the character is based on Tommy Two Guns DeSimone. And when Henry Hill was asked about Joe Pesci's performance, how accurate it was, he said there were only a couple of things that were not accurate. He said, number one, the real life Tommy was a really huge guy, like 6'5", and he was a lot younger. And the real Tommy was just a little bit meaner and a little bit crazier.
And imagine that. Imagine that being possible. Pesci's performance in that movie, that's one of the most terrifying characters in the history of the movies. I mean, just off his rocker, murderous, hot-tempered rage, and brilliantly performed.
The famous Funny How scene.
Yeah.
I believe that the scene was Pesci's idea, and it was based on a conversation he had heard in the restaurant. Yeah.
Scorsese went away and wrote it down, and they came back with it. They'd improvised it, but Liotta needed lines, so they wrote it down, came back, and said, "Okay, go," and then they shot it. And that's probably his Oscar-winning scene. You know, if he did no other moment in the movie, that scene would get him his Academy Award. But I also love his reaction when he walks into the room, and it's very quick when he walks into the room and realizes he's a dead man. He has time to say, "Oh," no, and they shoot him. And brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I've heard some argue, use that scene as a reference, that there's an argument the Academy needs an award for best scene.
Maybe.
Let's talk about Scorsese and improvisation. There's a lot of commonplace practice these days in comedy films, like the stuff Judd Apatow directs and produces, where these guys will just sort of riff and improvise and just shoot tons and tons and tons of footage that gets edited down. Scorsese, would you consider him a pioneer of this technique?
He's not afraid of it. Scorsese, I think he was a pioneer in his trust for his actors. I think if a director does not trust his actors, he's a fool. And Scorsese had enormous trust for De Niro, for Harvey Keitel, for Ellen Burstyn, for whoever he worked with. And that whole "you talking to me" scene in Taxi Driver, that was improvised. Scenes in Raging Bull between Jake and Joey, he just let them go. And they stayed in character, and he shot it. And it ended up in the film. Clint Eastwood is famous for shooting the rehearsals. You know, they'll rehearse a scene, they'll improvise a little bit, and he'll shoot it. Meryl Streep said she couldn't believe the freedom on the set on a Clint Eastwood movie. She said she had never experienced it before. So yeah, I would say Scorsese was a pioneer in both the level of trust he had for the actors and certainly telling them to go off book, you know, improvise it, do it, be in character. And he still does it. He does it to this day. And I think it's inspired a lot of younger filmmakers, Noah Baumbach, David Fincher, to do the same, to trust their actors and let them. The script isn't precious. You know, the writer has given them the blueprint, so let them go to the next level.
I think it's a technique that was also used. You know, I know it was in The Irishman. I've heard him talk about it. There's
Often.
There's a scene in The Irishman that made me laugh so hard, and it's the scene where Jimmy Hoffa is yelling at a bunch of underlings in his office, and it starts off as, "I am standing in a room full of fucking idiots," and in my head I imagine that Scorsese just went to Pacino and said, "Al, you like to yell? I want you to yell like you've never yelled before.
Insult them all, get them all." What I love is how De Niro walks out of the room in a huff, almost pouting. I'm not going to be talked to like that.
Yeah. Well, the thing that caught me was when Pacino's like, "You give it to his fucking fathers," and then he stops.
Yep.
He's like choking on these words, and I'm wondering, like, did he forget his line? Did he just kind of go with it? Like, I don't know, but it's awe-inspiring to watch.
Pacino is one of the great improvisers of all time. I mean, Brian De Palma let him go in Scarface with that drunk scene in the restaurant. That's entirely improvised. That's entirely. Amazing. And a lot of people thought Pacino was really drunk, but he wasn't. They said, cut, and he snapped sober.
Wow. In 1991, Martin Scorsese directed Cape Fear. There is a story that he swapped this film with Steven Spielberg, who was originally set to direct it.
Yep, true story.
And Spielberg encouraged Scorsese to take Cape Fear because it would be a commercially appealing film and it would give Scorsese more control over his creative process in his future endeavors.
Yes. Scorsese at one point had been set to direct Schindler's List, and he'd been attached to it, but Sid Sheinberg didn't think he was the right filmmaker for it. He thought it needed a director with Jewish background. So he and Spielberg switched films. And he'd been a big fan of the original Cape Fear with Gregory Peck and Robert Mitchum. And he decided to make it a big Hollywood epic. It was the biggest budget he'd ever worked with. Universal stayed away from him and let him make the movie he wanted to make. He had a great cast: Robert De Niro, Nick Nolte, Jessica Lange, and a very young Juliette Lewis. And he made a real potboiler. You know, it was very successful at the box office, successful with critics. 3 Academy Award nominations. It did extremely well and made Scorsese a so-called bankable director. He had 2 big movies back to back, Goodfellas and now Cape Fear, so he could get some films made that he wanted to make.
Do you I heard Robert De Niro actually had real tattoos made with vegetable dye.
That's true. That's true.
Um, do you believe him as the Southerner fully?
Oh, I do. Absolutely. But you also got to remember he's playing a part. Max Cady is playing a bad guy. He's a psychopath,
Yeah.
but he's exaggerating the character Max Cady. Max Cady is the big bad wolf. And he tells the little girl that when he's sitting in the theater, sitting in that little fake house. So he's a little over the top, as Nicholson was in The Shining, but it works because he's playing a really bad dude. When he bites that woman's cheek off, I mean, he makes clear the type of guy he is. When he makes that little girl suck his thumb, he's making it very clear who he is. He's a bad dude, and he needs killing. If anybody needed killing, it was Max Cady. It's a brilliant performance. And he didn't do one bit of campaigning for an Academy Award and was still nominated. That's how much the actors think of Robert De Niro.
For our listeners, I'd like to just mention I grew up as a big fan of The Simpsons, and the second episode of the 5th season of The Simpsons is an episode titled Cape Fear, and the entire episode is a spoof of both the Scorsese remake and the original Cape Fear film, where Sideshow Bob is coming after Bart Simpson to kill him, and it even uses the same score, and it's brilliant. I actually had seen that before I saw Cape Fear. It's just one of those interesting things for being someone of my generation. I sometimes see things through parody and homage before I see the originals, but yeah, I like Cape Fear a lot. I think it's a solid movie, and you know, I'm happy it got Scorsese the influence that he needed to continue doing what he was doing.
Me too.
Now, in 1995, the team of Nicholas Pileggi, Martin Scorsese, Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, amongst others, reunited for another film based on a true story called Casino.
Yeah,
Now,
and Casino got a bad rap when it first came out because a lot of people said it was Goodfellas Go to Vegas, which it's absolutely not. And they attacked Scorsese for doing the same film over and over and over. Well, between Goodfellas and Vegas, he made Cape Fear, he made The Age of Innocence, which he'd long wanted to do, an adaptation of the Edith Wharton novel, which was brilliant, and then he made Casino. And I love Casino. I think Casino is a rollicking rock and roll gangster movie with Joe Pesci again playing a terrifying killer, and De Niro as Ace Rothstein, this guy who ran Vegas for the mob. And I think it's a masterpiece in every way. Even Sharon Stone, who's not much of an actress, but man, she gives it in this movie. She's tremendous in this film. I don't think the nomination should have been for Best Actress. I think it should have been for Best Supporting. And had it been, she'd have won. She'd have won it, and she would have deserved it. It was just that type of movie. But the critical community kind of turned on him for that, and I was never really sure why. Today, it's got a whole revisionist look, and people love it. They're looking at it as an underappreciated masterpiece, and so they should.
yeah, I watched The Irishman with my mother, and then she was sort of on a Scorsese trip, and I said, "Let's watch Casino," and she loved it. And I gotta agree with you. I mean, Sharon Stone is just unreal, like
Yes, tremendous
stupidly
performance.
good, stupidly
Yep.
good.
Yep.
Casino and Goodfellas. Something else that deserves mentioning is the soundtracks for these movies. The
It's
music.
interesting with Scorsese and music. You're absolutely right. The soundtracks in both of those films are tremendously good. And I think in all of Scorsese's films, in The Wolf of Wall Street, in The Irishman, his selection of music is just perfection on every level.
And we'll in a little bit we're going to talk about Scorsese and music, and you know, he's such an iconic narrative film director. Sometimes people forget that his documentary career stands on its own.
Yes, it does.
And we'll get to that in a bit. Let's see, what time are we running at here? Okay, we're still good. you want to talk a little bit about Kundun?
Yeah, we can. Kundun was an interesting movie. He'd wanted to make a film about the Dalai Lama for a long time, and Disney, of all studios, was willing to do it. Their touchstone arm agreed to let him do it, gave him a reasonable budget. I think it was 22 million, and off he went to make it. And when the film came out, audiences just didn't know what to make of the movie. I saw it opening night and was puzzled by it because it's such a different Scorsese film, and I'm okay with different Scorsese. Alice Doesn't Live Here was different Scorsese. Last Temptation was different. Age of Innocence was different. And this is a very, very powerful movie, but it almost felt muted, like he couldn't cut loose like he always has as a director. He had to pay homage to the Tibetan religion by staying low key, by staying as quiet as he'd ever stayed as a filmmaker. There's one scene, a dream sequence, where the Dalai Lama is surrounded with other monks being slaughtered that felt Scorsese, but that's the only one. And critics were respectful to it. Audiences, they just didn't go. They just didn't go. I think it got 3 Oscar nominations, all in the craft category: art direction, cinematography, and sound, I believe.
Do you consider Bringing Out the Dead to be the kind of his least impressive effort?
It's one of them. It's one of them. I remember seeing it at a press screening and just being so disappointed. I hadn't been that disappointed at a film since, probably The English Patient, which I just hated. And I really hope that Nick Cage and John Goodman would bring out the best in Scorsese. And a great idea, Ambulances in New York City. It just didn't happen for me. It's a popular movie. A lot of people love it. I know you like it.
I like it. Yeah, I wouldn't say I love it.
Didn't work for me. It just didn't work for me. I was hoping, with Scorsese, you're always hoping for a great film, which is unfair because he's allowed to make some stinkers, and he has made some weak movies. Gangs of New York is a weak film, but this one,
test that wholeheartedly.
this one was especially weak, I think, and just on every level failed for me.
Okay, Gangs of New York. I honestly, one of my favorite movies ever. I know you have issues with it. I remember back in the day, I was back when video rental stores still existed. Me and some friends decided we were going to hang out and we were going to watch a movie, and we went to this local mom and pop video rental store. And this was before much of my education on cinema, and I had never even seen a Martin Scorsese movie. I didn't really know much about who he was, and I just
wow, good start.
I saw the box art for Gangs of New York, and I said, "Guys, this is it. Don't ask me why. I just know that it is." And we watched it, and we all loved it. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't know who this Daniel Day-Lewis guy is, but he's going places. The opening scene where they're inside and the Irish music is playing and it's all very warm golds, the colors and everything, and Neeson comes up to Brendan Gleeson, talks to him about the money, and then he kicks that door open and you see the snow and everything just drops silent.
Yeah.
And then all the gangs line up and you see the natives and the dead rabbits, and that battle sequence was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Let's not just turn this into me, going nuts praising the movie. Talk about it a bit, and what some of the flaws are that you think the movie has.
Well, like you, I think that opening is stunning, and I think the closing is stunning. The second battle is impressive, and Daniel Day-Lewis gives an absolutely extraordinary performance. Just a gut-punching, rage-filled performance of this guy who enjoys killing. He's not called Bill the Butcher just because he cuts meat. He cuts people up too, and he likes it. And Day-Lewis, to me, was so good that he dominated the entire film, and the other actors just didn't have a chance. Liam Neeson is the only actor that goes toe-to-toe with Daniel Day-Lewis in that film, and he's out of the movie 10 minutes in. DiCaprio is very good, no question. He's very good, but you need great. against Daniel Day-Lewis at that point, and DiCaprio hadn't reached that level. He's a brilliant actor, one of the best, but he wasn't there yet. He was almost there, but not quite. Cameron Diaz was atrocious. Her accent's
Yeah.
all over the place. Her Jenny Everdeen. You could cast any young actress in that movie, and they would have been better. You know, Natalie Portman should have played that part, but she didn't.
That would have been great.
Yeah. I thought it went on a little bit too long. And you know me, I don't mind how long movies go as long as they're doing something. But I thought the whole business towards the end, where the Irish are getting off the ship and being enlisted into the army for the Civil War, did we need that? Did we need the close-up of the jar of ears sitting on Day-Lewis's table? Did we need a lot of extra composition scenes that Scorsese gave us? And the final battle is exciting, but it's done in a fog. You know, there's a lot you can't see. And that to me was a little bit pretentious, a little bit frustrating. As a film, you know, it was nominated for 10 Academy Awards, and there was a whole campaign by Harvey Weinstein and Miramax to get Martin Scorsese his Oscar. And I would think a lot of people voted for Roman Polanski just because they didn't think Scorsese deserved it for Gangs of New York, and they would be right. So that's my rant, Nick.
Well, that's okay. I mean, we can agree to disagree.
Yeah.
Now,
I think it's a good movie, truly a good movie. And I love the ending scene where they're standing in the graveyard and we watch New York morph into what it was as U2 sings that song. That's what's wonderful. But I just didn't think it was a fantastic film all the way through. And it should have been, and it could have been.
interesting point to note about that final morph of the New York City skyline. It does include the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, even after they had fallen. And when asked why, Scorsese said, "My film is about the people who built New York City, not those who tried to tear it down."
And what a great quote. What a great quote. And the release of that movie was delayed a full year because of what happened at 9/11. They pulled it back. You know, it was to come out 2001. It came out a year later because they didn't think it was proper to release it after 9/11. So,
and Daniel Day-Lewis, just unreal.
oh, incredible. But you're talking about an actor who I'm not sure has ever been bad. You know, he's been weak. He was weak in 9. But, you know, he's got 3 Academy Awards, Best Actor Academy Awards. He could have won for Gangs of New York easily, and it wouldn't have been out of place.
I can't remember the context, but I think it was on a Facebook post. Somebody answered a question someone else had posted, and they said runner-up to Daniel Day-Lewis. And then I responded, and I put that in quotation marks, runner-up to Daniel Day-Lewis, the greatest achievement any actor could hope for.
Yeah, well.
The Aviator. I am not the biggest fan, although I do think it's a good movie. What are your thoughts?
I think this is the movie where DiCaprio became a great actor. So much had been written about Howard Hughes. Warren Beatty was going to make his Howard Hughes movie through the 70s, through the 80s. Scorsese reads this script by John Logan, and he's in. But he's not in because it's Howard Hughes, The Aviator. He's in because it's Howard Hughes in early Hollywood. And he wanted to make a picture about that. And I am a fan. I think it's one of his best films. I think it should have won the Best Picture Oscar. I think it should have won Scorsese. Well, I think he should have won the Oscar for Raging Bull years earlier, but it certainly should have got him his Oscar over Eastwood that year. Just a dazzling film. His creation of old Hollywood was wonderful, beautifully cast. I mean, Kate Blanchett as Katharine Hepburn is just perfection.
Yeah.
And Jude Law, briefly on screen as Errol Flynn, but he's perfect, absolutely perfect as Errol Flynn. And DiCaprio giving this brilliant performance as this deeply flawed man whose whole life is going to be lousy because of the demons that haunt him. And I thought DiCaprio was towering, just a towering piece of acting.
Yeah, I guess I can't really disagree with your assessment. I guess maybe the subject matter didn't resonate with me as much as I would have liked. But, you know, maybe it deserves another revisit from me.
I'd go back and take a look just because it's Scorsese and just because it's DiCaprio.
Yeah, I mean, Kate Blanchett, no argument there. She was absolutely brilliant. I remember liking, I think a good example of it is a scene on the golf course where the tones of the colors of the screen are more of like blues and reds.
Yeah.
And I know there was a reason that he did that. I think it was perhaps like early film technology could only register those colors, and he was trying to mimic that. I mean, the guy's a genius,
That's
obviously.
exactly so. He wanted to capture what the early Technicolor could handle, and that's what he did. He and Richardson worked on that together. Robert Richardson is DOP, and it won the Oscar for cinematography.
Martin Scorsese has time and again revisited the themes of Italian American identity, and New York City has always been a central theme, plot point, if not a character in and of itself. So one day he decided to talk about the Irish mob in the city of Boston.
And he won his first Academy Award. So well deserved. So well
Yes.
deserved. The first time I saw The Departed, I was stunned because he had remade a Hong Kong film called Infernal Affairs and made it a deeper film, a greater film, and a more powerful film. It was his first time working with Jack Nicholson, and Nicholson was Joe Pesci style terrifying as Frank Costello. DiCaprio, Matt Damon, Martin Sheen, Mark Wahlberg, Alec Baldwin, all of them absolutely iconic performances, and so many little moments in that film. Martin Sheen being tossed off the building, landing, and that little sound DiCaprio makes when this man he so admires is dead in front of him. Costello coming out of the back of his bar, his hands covered in blood. You don't know what's going on. We never see what's going on, but we know it's not good. And the elevator sequence as they come to the bottom, Matt Damon saying to DiCaprio, "Just kill me," because he knows he's dead. And the elevator opens and boom, DiCaprio shot dead. Just a masterpiece of a movie.
I remember seeing the trailer for The Departed and getting really, really amped up, thinking, "Oh man, look at this cast! It's Scorsese. This is going to be awesome!" And instantly, "Comfortably Numb" became my favorite song.
Yeah.
I think when DiCaprio gets popped in the head, I was so unbelievably shocked that happened.
So was I. Didn't see it coming, not at all. And when Damon very quickly kills the two guys at the bottom of the elevator, I was equally shocked. You know, it was he just kept us guessing right through to the end, and Damon opens his door, and there's Mark Wahlberg, and you're done, buddy. Your turn.
And then it focuses on the windowsill, and the rat walks across the frame.
Yep, perfect.
That rat was 100% CGI. Just a little piece of trivia.
Yes, it was.
Nicholson's one thing I think that's kind of strange, of all the performances in that movie, Mark Wahlberg gets the only acting nomination at the Oscars.
Yeah, that was strange because Nicholson got a Screen Actors Guild, a Golden Globe, and finished runner-up at the New York Film Critics Awards. Very strange, but it happens. You know, Nicholson, I don't think campaigned very hard, and I don't think by that point in his career he cared if he won another Oscar. It would have been nice to see. That's really his last great performance. I mean, after that he did The Bucket List and How Do You Know? And I mean, he's not going to be remembered for those, but he will be remembered for this. And another point of improvising, Scorsese just let him go. And there was one sequence where he pulled a gun on DiCaprio and started waving it around. Another point in the theater, he pulled a dildo on Matt Damon, and they're thinking, what is, they just said he kept them so on their toes. They just never knew what was coming next. And he himself was tremendous.
Yeah, I heard for one of those scenes, I think it was the movie theater scene. I'm sure I'm getting some of the specifics wrong, but I heard like the assistant director went up to Matt Damon. He's like, "Look, Jack's got a gun, a whiskey bottle, a fire extinguisher, a rubber chicken, and a dildo. We don't know what he's going to do. Just go with it."
That's a true story.
One of my favorite lines in that movie is after he puts the guy's dismembered hand in the bag. He's eating his breakfast and he's talking to DiCaprio. And he's like, "John Lennon said, I'm an artist. You give me a fucking tuber, I'll get you something out of it."
I love when he shoots the couple. He and his buddy Frenchie shoot the couple on the Jersey shore.
Yeah.
and he shoots the woman in the head, and he looks at his friend and says, "She fell funny."
Yeah.
And I just thought, my
Prince
God,
really should
what
see somebody.
a monster.
I gotta say, not like this is even a flaw, but one of the most bizarre attempts at an American accent in film history has got to go to Ray Winstone for The Departed.
Yeah, I would agree. I would
But
agree.
he was great.
He was good. He was good. He didn't say much, but he, radiated danger, menace, which he was supposed to do. Good actor.
And Vera Farmiga also
She's
brilliant.
wonderful. She really, I really hope she goes further because I think she's a terrific actress.
I agree. I honestly think that The Departed is some of DiCaprio's best work, maybe even his finest performance.
I do too. I think I think his finest performance is Wolf of Wall Street, but I
Right.
think he certainly is electrifying in The Departed. I was shocked he was nominated for Blood Diamond instead of The Departed because I just thought The Departed was such a finer, more daring performance from him.
There are so many moments where he is, just mentally walking the tightrope and he doesn't know what's coming and there's
Yeah.
fear and the anxiety. It's just it's really surreal. I really think it's one of his crowning achievements for
No,
sure.
I would agree with you. The constant terror this guy's living with must have been horrifying. Death at every corner. He's caught, he's done. And not nicely. He's done.
Yeah. I think Alec Baldwin has some really brilliant moments of comedy in the movie. I one line that I always quote me and my friends is I'm sorry, this just came in last minute, it just leaked, I'm gonna go out for a smoke break. You want to go out for a smoke? Well, you don't smoke, huh? One of those fitness nuts? I'll go fuck yourself.
Yep, that's Baldwin.
Yeah.
Baldwin's a very funny guy, and he's a very menacing guy on screen. I mean, think back to Glenn Ross.
Yeah.
He can intimidate, brilliantly intimidate on screen. And I thought he was used terrifically in The Departed, as they all were. Martin Sheen is fatherly and mentorly and such a gentle man, and
Yeah.
meets such a horrible end. A horrible way to die. But flawless, a flawless cast.
I heard that De Niro had been considered for the Martin Sheen role. Is that do you know if
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I don't know why it didn't happen. De Niro was in the middle of doing a lot of crap at that point. A Scorsese movie might have done him the world of good. I don't know, but I'm glad Martin Sheen did it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We need to talk about what I think is an underappreciated movie. Almost, I would say, Scorsese's venture into the horror genre with Shutter Island.
And you know what? Another one of his very best movies. And Paramount, to their eternal shame, dropped the ball on this movie. It was set to be released in 2009, I believe.
Yep.
And for whatever reason, they bumped it to February 2010.
Yeah.
Movies released between January and April are graveyard movies the studios don't know how to release. And I just can't believe a studio doesn't know how to release a Martin Scorsese movie. This was one of the best reviewed movies of his career. It was one of the biggest hits of his career. And I think one of the most incredibly well acted movies of his career, top to bottom, by the entire cast. Michelle Williams is haunting and creepy in those flashback scenes. DiCaprio does some of his best work. And if you watch it a second, third, and fourth time, there's clues all the way through. You see them. DiCaprio's unshaven at the beginning on the boat. Mark Ruffalo's not. DiCaprio doesn't have any cigarettes. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense because they've come to this place for a few days. He's bumming cigarettes already. And all these little clues happen to point you in the direction of where it's going to go. But when you figure it out, it's still a head slapper. It's like, oh my God, really? And just an exceptional, well done movie. Paramount screwed up in such a big way. They should be ashamed of themselves.
I didn't have the luxury of experiencing the surprise because I had read the book.
Oh, well, I didn't.
Yeah, and after I read the book, I was just like, I'm kind of wishing I hadn't read the book.
Gotta stop doing that. Gotta stop that.
You think it's a bad idea?
I think it's a good idea to read the book after, which is what I usually do. If there's a film coming out and a director that I admire making a film out of a book, I'll read it after. Stephen King, I usually read before, and most of the time I'm disappointed by his films, because most directors don't know how to make a Stephen King movie. Frank Darabont does, Stanley Kubrick did, but a
Amen.
lot of people don't.
Yeah, you know what? It's something that's happened so few times in my life that I've read a book that's later made into a movie. Um, Although I did read I Heard You Paint Houses uh,
Yeah,
before The Irishman, and that one I don't regret at all because that wasn't a movie where there was going to be something that was going to be spoiled for me. Like I kind of knew what was coming, and that wasn't really the point.
right, right.
Um, I think Shutter Island, yeah, again, I mean, just masterfully made and edited. Again, credit where credit is due to Thelma Schoonmaker.
Yeah,
Um, would you agree that that's sort of a horror movie?
yeah, I would put that as a horror film in the style of The Silence of the Lambs and Seven. Something horrible is happening at that psychiatric center. And Scorsese, it's also a film noir in a lot of ways, but I would say it's a noir crossed with a horror film, kind of bashed together. And Hitchcockian almost as well. I'm not a big Hitchcock fan, but Scorsese is. And I like that he made a big budget Hitchcock film like that and pulled it off.
We have to talk about a movie that is not really like anything else Martin Scorsese has done, but it's a movie I absolutely adore, and that's Hugo.
Hugo's such an interesting Scorsese film because you're right, he never made anything like this. It's based on a very popular children's book. And when I heard he was making it, I kept asking why. And then I heard he was making it in 3D, and even more so, why? Because he doesn't need 3D. 3D to me is a cheap gimmick. But if any director was going to know how to use 3D, it was going to be Martin Scorsese. So when the film came out, critic screening, of course, with the press, and he had gone beyond a children's book. He'd made a film about the beginnings of cinema. And of course it's going to be brilliant because Martin Scorsese is a walking encyclopedia of film history. So he chose to make a movie, merge this with the life of Georges Méliès, the French filmmaker, who was really the first narrative film director. A Trip to the Moon and a lot of his films were stories. He realized that you could tell a story. And it's a breathtaking movie. I mean, Asa Butterfield is wonderful as Hugo, Ben Kingsley, terrific as Georges Méliès. But it's an educational film too, in that you learn how Georges Méliès made a lot of his films. And a lot of this was new to me. I hadn't studied Méliès that in depth, so watching the film, I was learning and being entertained and educated as well. So, terrific movie, deserved every one of its 5 Academy Awards. A complete change of pace for Scorsese, and I like that he said he made it for his children. He made it for Francesca. He wanted her to have a film that she could watch because a lot of dad's films aren't for little girls, and this one was, and I like that.
Yeah. Did you see it in 3D?
I did, and I was right. Who else? Who else but Scorsese would know how to use 3D best, and he did.
To this day, I see lots of movies in 3D. To this day, the most stunning use of 3D filmmaking technology, like blows Avatar out of the water.
Yep, I agree.
And an absolute love letter to cinema.
Yes, and who better than Martin Scorsese to make it? It was a perfect choice of director with material, with the actors involved. Ben Kingsley is wonderful as Georges Méliès, wonderful, and Scorsese, well, he rocked it again, didn't he?
Yeah. You recently named The Wolf of Wall Street, side note, interchangeable with The Irishman, as the best film of the last decade.
Yes, I did, and I stand by it.
Talk about your experience seeing it for the first time.
Pardon?
Tell us about your experience seeing it for the first time.
It was like a great rock and roll song. It grabbed you from the opening, maybe a guitar riff, and held you until the very end of the film. I thought Leonardo DiCaprio gives just a towering performance in this movie, as good as anything Brando, Duvall, Nicholson ever did. And Scorsese is back in New York, but he's in a different type of criminal world. He's in the criminal stock world. And it tells the true story of Jordan Belfort. And they pull no punches. They show this guy for what he was, which was a criminal, a thief, a liar. and a brilliant statistician. He he took control and just milked everybody for their money and made hundreds of millions of dollars, enjoyed a great life for a long time, and then got caught, then got busted by the FBI. He knows they're coming for him. They tell him, and he doesn't back down. He doesn't think to go legal. He doesn't think to slow down. It doesn't occur to him. He loves what he's doing so much, he just continues. You've got DiCaprio at the top of his game, Jonah Hill, who's become an unexpected wonder as an actor, Margot Robbie in the first major film of her career, and she's turned into a phenomenal actress, and Scorsese, like a conductor, just making this extraordinary movie. It never lets you go from the minute it opens.
Can't remember a time in a theater recently that I've laughed harder.
And people forget that. They forget that it's a very black comedy. That scene where the two of them are on Quaaludes and they lose control of their bodies, their voice box, everything is hysterical. And for DiCaprio, he's never done drugs. He's never used alcohol. So how did he get to that place where he could do that? He must have studied or watched. I don't know. But he did it.
I can answer that. There, especially the scene where he's trying to get in and out of the Lamborghini.
Yeah.
So there is a famous YouTube. Well, famous. There's an infamous YouTube video. I think it's called "Drunkest Guy Ever Tries to Buy Beer," and it's convenience store security footage of a guy, waddling into the store to try and grab a case of beer, and this guy's hammered off of his ass, and he manages to get to the fridge, and once he pulls that case of beer out, he falls on his ass, and he's trying to get up and lifting that case of beer. It's like it's Thor's hammer, and he is just not worthy. It is one of the funniest things I have ever seen, and I found out that it was that exact video that DiCaprio used to he studied it ruthlessly because he thought it was so funny, and that's where a lot of that physical comedy came from.
Well, fair enough. I did not know that. He absolutely nailed it, as did Jonah Hill. And there's also a real, the comedy, there's a real glee in DiCaprio's eyes as to what he's getting away with. When his father, so well played by Rob Reiner, comes storming in with all these receipts for hookers, for ridiculous bar tabs. It's hysterical because he just doesn't care. He's going to do what he's going to do. I'm going to keep doing this, Pop. They're never going to get me. I'm smarter than they are. Well, he wasn't. They got him.
Yeah. It's a ride, man. It's a roller coaster ride.
It is.
There's another movie that was a passion project for Martin Scorsese. He'd been wanting to make it for decades, and he finally made it in 2016, a film called Silence.
Yeah, very good film.
This thing's hard to watch.
It is hard to watch. It's like all passion projects. We may not understand why it is so to him, but it's the kind of movie, I guess. It's a work of art, and not all art is accessible. We're not going to like all art. You go through an art gallery, there's going to be paintings you like, sculptures you like, but other stuff you wonder, what's this doing in here? And with Silence, it's that kind of movie. I admired it very much, and I think I probably admire it more than I like it. I think he captured the period to perfection. I thought it was extremely well acted by Garfield, by Adam Driver, and by Liam Neeson, and remarkably shot, beautifully shot, stunning cinematography. Is it a tough film to watch? Yes, it is. It's like Raging Bull in that sense. I've seen it twice, and I probably won't watch it again for a couple of years, but I will watch it again. And I thought, again, the critics loved it. I thought the Academy could have been a touch kinder to it. I mean, a single nomination, that was a little insulting. But a good film, a really good film.
Some people criticized it for asking too many big questions that it didn't have the courage to answer. I find that criticism insulting. And
Me too, because how do you answer what it's asking?
Those questions don't have easy answers. That's sort of the whole point.
That's right. And their main question is, why is God silent? Well, come on, really?
What's he going to do? Is he going to have, anyway. Very, very tough to watch, but I agree with everything you said. It's a work of art, and I can see why he wanted to make it.
Yeah, me too, me too. And I'm glad he made it, and I'm glad I saw it. Um, but again, it's a demanding film. It makes real demands on its audience.
And it's another long one.
Yes, it is.
We talked a bit last episode about The Irishman. Let's talk about it some more.
Anytime, anytime.
You mentioned how that opening scene in the nursing home is an homage to the scene in Goodfellas where they go through the
Yeah.
restaurant kitchen. You had mentioned when we were talking a lot of little references and things you had spotted in the movie. You want to talk about some of those?
Yeah, I think I mean, it's kind of the Holy Trinity. You watch Goodfellas, Casino, and The Irishman together. And to me, The Irishman is a very melancholy film about regret. And when Frank gets to the end of his life, his friends are all dead, and he had a part in killing some of them. And all of a sudden, he's alone, and even his own family will have nothing to do with him. His daughter knows what he is. You know, those accusatory eyes of Anna Paquin, always staring at him, all knowing, absolutely knowing what he does. Frank could be any of the characters from Goodfellas, any of the character. He could be Ace Rothstein from Casino, transplanted from film to film to film. And I think the pain that he's in at the end of the movie is the consequences for his life, you know, for deciding to live this life, for being a man who painted houses, for being a killer, for taking out Jimmy Hoffa, for taking out all the men he did. This is the price you pay. You're going to die alone, and know you're alone, and be lonely.
Yeah, I think the way I have summarized it is Goodfellas is like weird gangsters and we live like rock stars.
Mm-hmm.
And the
when
Irishman,
when we're young.
yeah, and the Irishman is like, yeah, in the end, it's probably not really worth it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's almost chronological. They are young in Goodfellas. We see them grow up, and in Casino, they're middle-aged, and their life is catching up to them. Crime is catching up to them, and in The Irishman, it does catch up to them. Life catches up to them. Their own circumstances catch up to them. It's a very sad film. It really is.
Do you think now that he's sort of completed this spiritual trilogy, do you think he has anything more to say on this in this genre?
I don't, and I hope not, because I would like to see him go in a different direction to see what he's got left. You know, he's talked about, so he's making a film right now with DiCaprio and Robert De Niro about a massacre of Indians in the 20s. He's still talking about making this Frank Sinatra film. So I hope he goes in some different directions, because we don't know how many films he's got left, you know, and I would like to see him make 3 or 4 more. But show us something new, because Martin Scorsese has always shown us something new.
Yeah, I one that's been talked about, which I really hope gets made, is the Rise of Teddy Roosevelt with
Yeah, me too. Me too.
For those of you who don't know, Teddy Roosevelt was the most badass motherfucking person who ever lived, and just to have DiCaprio play him in a Scorsese movie would be something else.
And a terrific president, you know,
Yeah.
in this time of the absolute buffoon in the White House right now, Teddy Roosevelt was a wicked, kick-ass president.
Right. The film you were just mentioning is based on the book Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders, and the Birth of the FBI.
Yep.
Written by David Gran. And yeah, it is it's uniting Scorsese and his 2 muses, DiCaprio and De Niro.
I believe it's shooting. I believe it's already shooting.
I think you're right.
Yep.
Eric Roth has written the screenplay.
He wrote Forrest Gump, so it'll be a good one.
Yeah. All right. We've talked a lot and we've covered a lot. Before we sign off, talk a little bit about Martin Scorsese, the documentary filmmaker, and what do you think are some of the his best work he's done there? I know it's kind of hard to encapsulate that in just a couple of minutes, but
Well, I think his best work as a documentarian always goes back to rock and roll. And I think that comes from Woodstock. He saw the power of documenting rock and roll in Woodstock and the importance of it. His first great documentary was The Last Waltz, which was a chronological study of the band, Robbie Robertson,
Mhm.
who was his best friend at the time as well. They've remained good friends. But he's continued to make excellent documentaries throughout his career. He's made docs with the Rolling Stones, with U2, with Bob Dylan. He had one this year with Bob Dylan that had tremendous acclaim. And he seems to like to study earlier rock and roll of the 60s, U2 accepted, of course, and goes back to archival footage and old concert footage and really brings it to life. I think it would be thrilling to see Martin Scorsese make a biography of somebody like Bob Dylan or Elvis Presley or John Lennon, something like that, because I think he would do an extraordinary job. But his documentaries are always exciting. They're always critically acclaimed, and they do very, very well in the industry, in terms of box office. So the guy can't lose. Whatever he touches is gold.
do you have a personal favorite documentary?
I think The Last Waltz. The Last Waltz holds up very well. I remember seeing it for the first time and just thinking, wow, nobody's ever explored rock and roll like this. I think there have been better rock documentaries made. There was one on Bruce Springsteen and E Street Band a couple of years ago that was exceptional. But I think The Last Waltz holds up extremely well. The one on U2 was very good too. And this year's Bob Dylan was exceptional. But I think The Last Waltz does it for me.
For me, personally, it's Living in the Material World, the George Harrison.
Another great one. Another great one,
I'd love to see. I've always thought that George Harrison and his relationship with Patty Boyd and Eric Clapton would be a great subject for a film, and someone like Scorsese tackling that, that's the dream. But
well, he'd be the guy to do it, that's for sure.
Yeah, I don't get to make those kind of decisions. All right, John. Well, we've gone almost about an hour and a half here, which is fine. I mean, we make the rules, but I think we've given a good hard look at who I would say is the greatest living filmmaker in Hollywood. Do you have any final thoughts before we sign off?
No, I agree completely. I think he's a genius. I think every accolade he's got has been deserving. If the Academy was just, he would have 5 Academy Awards for Best Director. He should have won for Raging Bull, should have won for Last Temptation, Goodfellas, just on and on. The Departed and Wolf of Wall Street. So the one this year would be his 6th. And I hope Oscar night they give it to him.
Yeah, me too, for sure. I think The Irishman, hands down, is the best movie of 2019.
Me too. No question.
There you have it, folks. Episode 002 in the bag. Spotlight Scorsese. We hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of our content online at www.footandfriendsonfilm.com. Please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Any comments, questions, insights, revelations, things you'd like to hear on the podcast, don't hesitate to let us know. You can also shoot us an email at footandfriendsonfilm@gmail.com. Stay tuned for episode 3, which will be dedicated entirely to Mr. Tom Hanks. Until next time, folks, we'll see you at the movies.